My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 52 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. I thought I was showing up for a family dinner. I had no idea I was walking into a setup. By the time the third seafood tower arrived, I already felt like something was off. My family wasn't known for celebrating, especially not at a restaurant, where a single lobster cost more than some people's weekly grocery budget. Yet there they were, ordering without hesitation. Plate after plate, bottle after bottle, dessert after dessert. My older brother chose the most expensive items on the menu, and everyone else seemed determined to follow his example. Nobody asked about prices. Nobody looked concerned. They simply kept ordering. Then the check arrived. The conversation stopped almost instantly. My brother glanced at the total, pushed the bill across the table, and smiled. "You're paying, right?" My mother nodded. My sister nodded. Even my cousins looked at me as if the decision had already been made. I looked down at the bill, nearly $4,000. I was stunned, but not completely surprised. Earlier that evening, I had noticed something strange. At the time, it seemed insignificant. A few hours later, I realized it explained everything. A week earlier, my mother had called me out of the blue. That alone was unusual. We spoke occasionally, but most conversations lasted only a few minutes before ending with polite small talk. This time was different. She sounded cheerful, almost excited. She told me the family was planning a special dinner and said everyone wanted me there. According to her, it was simply a chance for us to spend time together and reconnect. I remember sitting in my kitchen after the call, staring at my phone and wondering why the invitation felt so strange. For years, I had been the family member who was easy to overlook. There had been birthdays I wasn't told about until afterward, holiday gatherings I learned about through social media, and family decisions made without anyone asking for my opinion. Being included was never the norm, yet suddenly everyone seemed eager to see me. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. My brother texted. My sister checked in. Even cousins who rarely spoke to me started acting unusually friendly. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe they genuinely wanted to reconnect. But something about the sudden attention didn't feel natural. And a quiet voice in the back of my mind kept telling me there was more to this invitation than anyone was saying. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern much sooner. Growing up, I was the responsible one in the family. While my siblings spent money as quickly as they got it, I saved every dollar I could. I worked part-time jobs in high school, paid my own expenses whenever possible, and learned early that if I wanted something, I would have to earn it myself. My parents often praised responsibility in theory, but in practice, things worked differently. My brother received help whenever he got into financial trouble. My sister was constantly given second, third, and even fourth chances after making expensive mistakes. Somehow, there was always money available to rescue them. For me, the expectation was different. Because I rarely asked for help, people assumed I didn't need any. Because I managed my problems quietly, my efforts often went unnoticed. Family gatherings weren't much better. I was usually included when someone needed advice, a ride, a favor, or help solving a problem. Once the crisis passed, I faded into the background again. Over time, I built a successful career through years of long hours, sacrifices, and careful planning. Nothing came easily, but I was proud of what I had accomplished. Unfortunately, my family didn't see the years of work behind that success. They only saw the outcome. To them, I wasn't Sarah, the daughter or sister. I was the reliable one, the one who could always fix things. And as I would eventually discover, that expectation hadn't disappeared as we got older. If anything, it had become even stronger. As the years passed, my career continued to grow. I wasn't wealthy, at least not in the way my family imagined. But I had built a comfortable life. I owned my home, had savings, and didn't live paycheck to paycheck. Everything I had came from decades of careful decisions and hard work. Somewhere along the way, reality turned into family legend. Every promotion became bigger than it actually was. Every accomplishment was exaggerated. Relatives who knew nothing about my finances started making assumptions about how much money I earned. According to family gossip, I was practically rich. The truth was far less dramatic. What they didn't see were the years I skipped vacations, worked late nights, and turned down luxuries so I could build financial security. They saw the result, but never the sacrifices behind it. What frustrated me most was the double standard. Whenever my brother accumulated debt, someone had an excuse ready. When my sister made another expensive mistake, everyone rushed to defend her. Their poor choices were treated like unfortunate accidents. Meanwhile, my responsibility became a reason to place more expectations on me. If a family member needed help moving, they called me. If someone needed money, advice, or a solution, they called me. It slowly became clear that many relatives viewed my success as a shared resource, rather than something I had earned. That was why the sudden invitation kept bothering me. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered whether this dinner was really about family at all, or whether it had something to do with what they believed I could provide. The night of the dinner, I arrived a few minutes early at the restaurant. It was one of the most expensive places in Denver, the kind of restaurant people usually reserved for major celebrations. At first, I tried convincing myself I was overthinking everything. Then people started arriving. A few family members I expected to see walked in, but so did several people who had never been mentioned in the invitation. Cousins, spouses, and even a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly appeared at the table. Nobody seemed surprised except me. Before I could ask questions, everyone was busy studying the menu. The first few orders seemed normal enough. Then things changed. My brother ordered a premium lobster platter. My sister added king crab legs. Someone requested an expensive bottle of wine. Then another. Then another. The waiter barely had time to write everything down. As the meal continued, the orders became even more extravagant. Seafood towers arrived stacked high with lobster, crab, oysters, and shrimp. Appetizers covered the table. Desserts were ordered before dinner was even finished. A few relatives laughed about living large tonight. Another joked that opportunities like this didn't come around often. What caught my attention wasn't just what they were ordering. It was how they reacted whenever I commented on it. Each time I mentioned the cost or asked whether there was a special occasion I didn't know about, people exchanged quick glances. The conversations would suddenly shift. Someone would change the subject. The behavior was subtle, but it happened repeatedly. By the time the third bottle of wine was opened, a feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't random. The more I watched, the more it felt like everyone knew something I didn't. And I was beginning to suspect that I was the only person at that table who hadn't been informed of the plan. As the conversation continued around the table, I found myself paying less attention to what people were saying and more attention to the feeling growing in the back of my mind. It was a feeling I knew all too well. Over the years, there had been countless situations where I was expected to step in and help. I remembered family vacations where I somehow ended up covering extra expenses. I remembered last-minute emergencies that became my responsibility to solve. I remembered birthdays and holidays when I was quietly pressured into buying gifts that were far beyond what I could comfortably afford. At the time, I told myself I was helping family, but sitting there, watching everyone order without a second thought, those memories started fitting together in a way they never had before. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever something needed to be paid for, fixed, or handled, people eventually looked in my direction. The realization was painful, because I wanted to believe this dinner was different. I wanted to believe the invitation had been genuine. Instead, it was beginning to feel very familiar. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply watched. The more I observed, the more convinced I became that something was about to happen. And unlike previous times, I wasn't willing to walk into it blindly. What my family didn't know was that I had already taken a few precautions. Not long after everyone arrived, I noticed how unusually relaxed they seemed about spending money. Most people become at least a little cautious when dining at an expensive restaurant. But nobody at that table appeared concerned. In fact, some of them seemed almost excited by how quickly the total was climbing. That was when my instincts started warning me. During a trip to the restroom, I quietly stopped near the front desk and spoke with a member of the restaurant staff. I kept the conversation simple. I asked how the restaurant handled large group bills and whether individual orders could be separated if necessary. The employee assured me they could provide a detailed, itemized breakdown for every guest. I thanked them and returned to the table without mentioning a word. For the rest of the evening, I paid close attention. I watched who ordered what. I noticed who encouraged others to choose the most expensive options. I listened carefully to the jokes and comments people thought were harmless. The more information I gathered, the calmer I became. Years earlier, I might have ignored the warning signs and hoped for the best. But experience had taught me that preparation was often the difference between being manipulated and protecting yourself. So I smiled, participated in the conversations, and acted as though nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, the meal continued, and my family grew increasingly comfortable. By the time dessert menus appeared, they looked completely confident that everything was going according to plan. As the last desserts were cleared away, the mood at the table felt almost celebratory. People were laughing, finishing their drinks, and leaning back in their chairs as if the evening had been a complete success. Then the waiter arrived with the check. The moment I had been expecting finally arrived. My brother picked up the bill, glanced at it for only a second, and pushed it across the table toward me with a smile. "You're paying, right?" he said casually. A few people laughed. Then my mother joined in. "Well, you're the successful one," she said. "This shouldn't be a problem for you." Almost immediately, several relatives nodded in agreement. What shocked me wasn't that they expected me to pay. It was how openly they admitted it. One cousin laughed and said he had ordered the lobster because he assumed I was treating everyone. Another joked that he would have chosen something cheaper if he thought he was responsible for the bill. Around the table, heads nodded again. Nobody seemed embarrassed. Nobody asked whether I was comfortable paying. They simply assumed I would. In that moment, every suspicious glance, every strange comment, and every expensive order suddenly made perfect sense. This dinner had never been about reconnecting as a family. It had been about getting me to fund an extravagant night out. And when they looked at me, waiting for my answer, they seemed completely certain they already knew what it would be. I looked around the table, took a sip of water, and answered as calmly as I could. "No, I'm not paying for everyone's dinner." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then everything exploded. My brother's smile disappeared instantly. My sister stared at me as though I had just insulted her. My mother's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief. "What do you mean you're not paying?" my brother demanded. I repeated myself. The reaction was immediate. Suddenly I was being called selfish, greedy, ungrateful. My mother reminded me how important family was. My sister argued that people who had money should help those who didn't. Another relative claimed I was embarrassing everyone over something I could easily afford. The accusations came from every direction. What struck me most was how little anyone talked about their own choices. Instead, the entire conversation focused on what I supposedly owed them. Family should help family. Family should be generous. Family should support one another. The words kept repeating, but they all seemed to point in only one direction, toward me. As the voices grew louder, people became careless. One cousin admitted they had expected me to cover the bill from the beginning. Another complained that they would never have ordered so much if they thought they were paying themselves. My brother even argued that I should be grateful everyone wanted to celebrate with me. By then, nearby diners were beginning to notice. Conversations at surrounding tables slowed. A few people glanced in our direction. Even the restaurant staff seemed aware that something unusual was happening. My family thought they were pressuring me into giving in. What they didn't realize was that every complaint, every accusation, and every careless comment was making my next move much easier. Once the shouting finally slowed, I reached into my purse and calmly placed my phone on the table. I had a feeling something like this might happen, I said. The table went quiet. My brother folded his arms and rolled his eyes, clearly expecting another argument. Instead, I looked toward the restaurant manager, who had been standing nearby. Earlier that evening, after noticing how unusual everyone's behavior was, I had asked the staff an important question. If necessary, could they provide a detailed breakdown of every order placed at the table? The answer had been yes. A few moments later, the manager handed over a printed itemized receipt. I slid it across the table. The document listed everything. Every lobster platter, every seafood tower, every bottle of wine, every premium dessert. And next to each item was the seat number associated with the person who ordered it. The confidence around the table began to disappear. My cousin's face turned pale when he saw the total attached to his orders. My sister immediately started flipping through the pages. My brother stopped talking altogether. But that wasn't the most damaging part. The manager calmly explained that several guests had specifically requested the most expensive menu items. According to the staff, some of them had even joked that someone else was covering the bill, so price didn't matter. I didn't need to point fingers. The evidence spoke for itself. The same people who had been accusing me of selfishness just moments earlier were now staring at proof that they had intentionally spent money they never planned to pay. Nobody could deny it. Nobody could rewrite the story. For the first time all evening, the room was completely silent. And judging by the looks on their faces, my family was finally beginning to understand that their plan had just fallen apart. The silence didn't last long. My brother tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding. My sister claimed everyone had simply assumed I wanted to treat the family. My mother insisted that nobody meant any harm. For years, those explanations might have worked. This time I wasn't interested. I looked around the table and spoke more honestly than I ever had before. I am not responsible for the financial choices other adults make, I said. And being successful doesn't mean I owe anyone unlimited access to what I've worked for. Nobody interrupted. I continued. I reminded them of the favors, the financial help, and the countless times I had stepped in when someone needed support. I pointed out that generosity is something people choose to give, not something others are entitled to demand. The more I spoke, the weaker their excuses became. The facts were impossible to ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an expectation that I would quietly pay because I always had before, even some relatives who had stayed silent. Throughout the argument began distancing themselves from the situation. A few admitted they hadn't known the plan. Others avoided eye contact with my brother entirely. For the first time in years, I wasn't defending myself. I was setting a boundary. And judging by the expressions around the table, everyone finally understood that this boundary wasn't going away. Once it became clear that I wasn't backing down, the restaurant staff began separating the bill. The mood at the table changed instantly. People who had spent the entire evening acting carefree were suddenly studying receipts with growing panic. One cousin stared at his total and immediately reached for his phone. Another relative discovered that the expensive wine he barely remembered ordering had added hundreds of dollars to his portion of the bill. My sister had to use 2 different cards to cover her share. One family member stepped away from the table to call a spouse for help. Another quietly transferred money from a savings account. The person hit hardest was my brother. After all, he had ordered some of the most expensive items on the menu and encouraged others to do the same. When his total was calculated, the confidence he had carried all evening vanished. For once, nobody could shift responsibility onto someone else. Everyone paid for exactly what they ordered. Nothing more, nothing less. As I watched the process unfold, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. The lesson wasn't about money. It was about accountability. Their plan had depended on the belief that I would absorb the consequences of their decisions. Instead, they were finally facing those consequences themselves, and that was a lesson none of them would forget anytime soon. In the weeks after the dinner, the reactions were mixed. A few relatives continued criticizing me. According to them, I had embarrassed the family and made a simple situation unnecessarily difficult. For a while, those comments bothered me, but something unexpected also happened. Several family members quietly reached out and admitted I had been treated unfairly. Some confessed they had felt uncomfortable that night but didn't know how to speak up. Others acknowledged that expectations had been placed on me for years simply because I was responsible. For the first time, I stopped feeling guilty for saying no. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video. I also began creating distance from relationships that seemed to exist only when money, favors, or solutions were involved. As those connections faded, something else took their place. Relief. And that feeling taught me one final lesson. The truth is, the problem was never the money. I could afford dinner. I could have paid the bill without changing my lifestyle at all. What hurt wasn't the cost of the lobster, the wine, or the private dining room. What hurt was realizing that some of the people I loved saw me as a resource before they saw me as a person. That night exposed something years of family gatherings had hidden. Respect cannot survive where entitlement grows unchecked. The moment I stopped accepting manipulation disguised as family obligation, everything became clearer. Some relationships grew stronger afterward because they were built on genuine care. Others faded because they depended on what I was willing to provide. In the end, I gained something far more valuable than anyone's approval. I gained self-respect. And looking back, that expensive dinner was the turning point that finally taught me how I deserve to be treated. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more emotional family drama stories.